All right, I think we will start. First of all, welcome to the next session in the series from ISGAP on anti-Semitism in East and Southeast Asia in comparative perspective. This week, we are absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Dafna Zur. Dafna Zur is an associate professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at Standford University. She teaches courses on Korean literature, cinema, and popular culture. Her book, Figuring Korean Futures, Children's Literature in Modern Korea, was published by Standford University Press in 2017. The book traces the effective investments and coded aspirations made possible by children's literature in colonial and post-colonial Korea. She is working on a new project on moral education in science and literary youth magazines in post-war North and South Korea. She has published articles on North Korean science fiction, the Korean War in North and South Korean children's literature, childhood in cinema, and Korean popular culture. Her translations of Korean fiction have appeared in wordwithoutborders.org, the Columbia Anthology of Modern Korean Short Stories, and the Asia Literary Review. And after that very impressive introduction, Dr. Dafna Zur will be speaking on the intriguing title of the North Korean translation of Anne Frank's diary. She'll speak for around 30 minutes, and then we will open up the floor for questions. So do feel free to type your questions into the chat as Dr. Zur is talking. Thank you very much. Please do go ahead.
Great, thank you so much. I'm gonna just put on a little timer for myself so that I don't go, crazy. And then I will share my screen and get started. All right, well, thank you so much for that really generous introduction, Mary, and to the members of ISGAP for inviting me to this prestigious forum. I'm really honored to be here. It's 6 o'clock in the morning right now, and I've just come from overseas travel, so I'm not quite over my jet lag yet. So I'm hoping that, and I haven't had coffee, so I've got the cards stacked against me. But hopefully, I'll be able to kind of muster the kind of energy that I need to stay focused. But of course, I love this topic, and I'm really excited to share this research with you, which is going to be published in the Association of Jewish Studies Review in 2023. I don't have the exact date yet, but this will be coming out. So I'm really thrilled to have this also in the near future. So as Mary mentioned, I am a scholar of modern contemporary Korea, Korean literature. I'm a literary scholar. I also take a lot of interest in popular culture. So this project is really something that, like a lot of great things, one of the wonderful things about being an academic is that, there are a lot of sort of happy mistakes that happen, things that you don't plan that just sort of fall in your lap. And this was one of these projects. So, how did I come about to write an article, an in-depth research paper on something like, Anne Frank's diary, its translation North Korea? How did I even come across this? It's something I want to talk about first. So I was in the Library of Congress, this wonderful, incredible library that we have here in the United States in Washington, D.C. Around 2007, there's just a massive collection of North Korean materials going back to the 50s and 60s, very rare materials. In fact, in the world, there are very few places that you can actually get your hands on earlier materials, 50s and 60s, and the Library of Congress in DC is one of them. And it's not digitized. I mean, some materials are starting to be a little bit digitized, but mostly you just have to go there, pull things out, request them from the archive, and they bring them to you. And so there's really no way, even though, so much of what we do today is digital, the only way to really kind of see what's in these materials is to go there, bring the stuff out from storage, and because you can't go into the stacks and just look through them. And at the time I have a longstanding interest in science fiction. And so I was looking for anything with a keyword 과학소설, or science fiction in Korean, in North Korea. And so I was just sort of going through materials, the analog way, with my eye and my finger, and trying to find different 과학소설 and or science fiction. And all of a sudden I look down 4 lines. So the black arrow that you see on the screen right now is the title of a science fiction novel from 2002. And then my eye drops down 4 lines, and all of a sudden I see the 12th installment of Anne Frank's diary, meaning that I missed the first 11 because I wasn't paying attention. And so I, of course, just, was totally surprised. I didn't think that, this is before I had a really good sense that, in fact, there is quite an interesting body of kind of Western literature that has circulated in North Korea from the very early days, and what that literature is, and and why it's circulated, and who do North Koreans love to read. That's a talk for another time. And actually I have a colleague in Korea who's working on this, so I'm really excited to have her book out soon. But in any case, this surprised me, and it surprised me to think that I would find Anne Frank's diary in translation, that I would find it in North Korea. And so I started to kind of course, I had to go back and look at the first 11 installments, and then follow through and look at the next, few, and try and understand, what the translation was and what it was doing here. I didn't do it immediately. It took me like 10 years to get to it. I was doing other things, but it just kind of kept, I kept it in the back of my mind. And so I finally had a chance to go to Amsterdam. Actually, it was right before COVID, not knowing, of course, it was going to be one of my last trips. But back in 2019, I went to Moscow to the Lenin Library, where there's also a huge collection of North Korean materials. And then in August, I was on my way to a children's literature conference in Sweden. And on the way, I stopped in Amsterdam. And then I kind of went to the Anne Frank house. I just decided that was going to be the time where I was going to really connect with this material. And I started to really connect with Anne's diary in a very, I think, personal way. I mean, it's very, those of you who've read her diary, I mean, I feel like we all have, but if you really spend some time with it, especially these days, you realize a couple of things. First of all, this is a diary about quarantine. It's a diary about, what happens when 8 people are in a closed space with each other for, few years, driving each other crazy. And so that part of it really kind of was very, sort of refreshing for me to read it in, in the context of today. But I was also really, and obviously, there's a big difference, right, between the quarantine that we experienced, especially early on, the lockdown, where, we were afraid if we would go out, we would get the virus and, possibly die, versus Anne, who knew that if she would get out, she would be, she'd be immediately, killed, and her family would be killed. So, a little different, very different circumstance. But I was also, so that's the first thing that surprised me, sort of this quarantine aspect of it. But I also was very intrigued by the process of her writing the diary. I think most of us, if you haven't studied the diary in depth, you sort of take it for granted that this is a diary that Anne wrote from start to finish in her checkered, diary. I think many of us have seen what it what that looked like if you've been to Anne Frank's house, or if you know anything about the history of the material history of this book. But what I actually started to find was that the diary itself has a really complicated and fascinating history. that has to do with the way it was obviously written, in Dutch, in hiding. In the first part of it was written in this checkered notebook, but then she starts to write. So this is the diary was written, just some of the basics, between June 12th, 1942 and August 1st of 1944. And the family was discovered on August 4th, and then they were sent to their deaths. So she wrote, in fact, not just that notebook that we're all familiar with the checkered cover, but she wrote in a few notebooks and also on a lot of loose paper. Now, what's really interesting is that after about a year, she started to do a lot of rewriting. She started to think like a writer, and writers revise, right? That's what we do as writers. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that she wanted to document and to kind of craft her prose, because first of all, she heard on March 29th, 1944, there was a radio announcement that all of kind of wartime documents produced in this period would become a kind of legacy, would become a kind of testimonial to what experiences Jews were having. And so she suddenly realized, oh, this thing that I'm writing for myself to kind of appease my loneliness and to figure out what's going on in my head, this is actually a wartime document and people are going to read it. So she started to think about the importance of her work and also kind of the audience. And also the second reason she starts to rewrite is because her feelings, especially about the boy that she's with in quarantine, their Peter, start to change as well. So she starts to go back and make some changes. And so what we have today, if those of you who, and I'm sure there are many erudite, people on the call who know a lot more about this, than I do, but what you end up with, and today, what's really interesting, if you ever want to take the deep dive, I encourage you do, is we have different versions of this published in English. The first is 1952, Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl. That was the first publication of the English translation that came out with Eleanor Roosevelt's introduction. And then in 1989, you get the revised critical edition. And that is the thick volume that's on the leftmost side of this image. That's super fascinating book because it sets up almost like a biblical study, the original, and then her revisions, and then the material that her father Otto Frank worked with in publishing her original diary. So you kind of you can observe the transitions. And then the third is this definitive edition, which includes a lot of the material that were not included in this first version. So why am I going? I know there's a talk about North Korea in here. I've talked about Anne Frank's diary for the first 10 minutes. But why am I doing this? The reason I'm doing this is because I wanted to break free of the idea that the diary is this somehow sacred document that captures in the most transparent way the self's, the self in writing, and to really think about what it means to fictionalize the self. Now, I don't mean fictionalize as in fabricate, right? I'm not sort of saying that this was all made up or that it didn't happen. Of course not. But I think that the fictionalization impulse, the taking the raw material of the experience and turning them into, and assimilating and processing it in writing, is one that has to be taken into account when thinking about what it means to write one's experience. And then to go from there to understand, okay, then what did the translators do with this? And why does this appear in North Korea when it does? And what is it that the translators are trying to get out of this text when they publish it in North Korea? So in first trying to understand why this diary appears in North Korea when it does. I kind of came across, first of all, anytime you're working on North Korean text, you come up against the fact that the only access I have to North Korean published materials are in these libraries. And, I don't have big databases in North Korea that tell me that there are other versions or, so it's only what I can actually get my hands on. So right now I'm working on the assumption that unlike South Korea, where Anne Frank's diary was published in Korean almost immediately after the English translation came out in 1952. So the first South Korean translation came out in 1954. In North Korea, I did not find anything until the early 2000s. So you have, there were two versions. They're actually, I shouldn't say versions, they're identical translations. One was the one I said before, that was these installments that were from 1942 to 1944. I think there were 14 installments. I can't remember the number exactly. And they come out in the very first installment. 14 installments. It's right on my slide. From 2002 to 2004, they were published in a children's literature magazine called Adong Munak. And the very first one, and I think the ones after that maybe as well. Anyway, they say that the writer is Anne Frank, Anne Frank, and that the translator is someone named Lee Keum-jin. It's a male name, Lee Keum-jin. So that comes out in 14 installments. At the same time, there is a textbook version from 2002. Anne Frank 일기, right? So the Diary of Anne Frank, and that is published here. The publisher is the 교육도서 출판사, which is a kind of educational publishers in North Korea. In fact, sorry, I should say that the version, the 2002 single volume textbook version is the only one that mentions the translator. If I had not found the single volume, I would not have known who translated it, because the translator is not mentioned in the version that has installments. So the translations are identical. So Lee Keum-jin is the translator of both of these editions, and they have the same epilogue, but they have different introductions. And as scholars on Anne Frank's diary have always noted, the framing of the diary really tells us most of what we want to know about what it is that editors or translators are looking for. So that was where I started looking into trying to understand how it was translated, and why it was translated. Okay, so let's look at these two introductions. So here's the first one from the magazine, published in July of 2002. This was the time when Hitler, the barbarian, was in power, and the fascist Italian dictator Mussolini was growing in strength. The fascists were out to enslave not just their own people, but to spread fascism around the world. So that's the introduction, part of the introduction of the serialized version. And then this is from the book. Sorry, I'm going to ignore the text for now. Thank you for writing, but please write questions, and I'll get to them after the talk. We hope this book will be a precious friend and intimate travel companion for North Korea's new youth, who are wholeheartedly dedicated to the swift rise of our powerful and prosperous Juche nation, and who are committed to the arrival of peaceful unification. So the two texts then frame the diary as an anti-fascist, anti-imperialist text, and somehow suggest that this diary can be a kind of a guide on the path towards national prosperity and peace. So this kind of anti-fascist bent or anti-fascist orientation is one of the big explanations for why the North Koreans thought this text was so important. North Korea's, national myth is based on its sort of anti-imperialist, right? Sort of just national story, right? Of having pushed out the American invaders during the Korean War, right? According to the North Koreans, it's the Americans that invaded. So those are the introductions. So besides those introductions, I went line by line with the English. I don't read Dutch, so I went with the English translation, those multiple versions of the English. And then later I discovered, much later, because it wasn't mentioned anywhere, but I realized, it dawned on me much later, that actually the translator had worked with the German translation. So then I had the German translation also to look at. So I'm looking at line by line with the Korean and the German and the English to try and understand what the translators did. How did the translators, if they went word by word, line by line, or if they intervened. And of course they do intervene, or he does intervene in a really interesting way. So the translator intervenes in a number of interesting ways. First of all, there are in-text notes. So in-text notes that are not just glossing, not just explaining words that may be unfamiliar. So, first of all, what you learn from this is that, North Koreans have no idea that Hanukkah is pronounced Chanukah. They think it's Shanuka. That's how they romanized it. So you kind of realize, oh, like they don't have an ear. This is not material as familiar to them. But there's also a different kind. So there's some glossing notes, but there's an instance, mainly one instance. This one is the most interesting, where there is a word that is used in, that's translated from the German, let's say, into the Korean, but then it requires a note. And the reason it requires a note is because here, this is where Anne writes, and I'm reading the English. I've already told you before that I have, as it were, a dual personality. One half embodies my exuberant cheerfulness, making fun of everything, my high-spiritedness, and above all, the way I take everything lightly. So that was what she wrote in, I'm reading the English version. And then the Korean translated it in the part where she says, I take everything lightly. The Korean translated used the word kyonujui, which is the one you see on the left here before the parentheses, kyonujui, which is cynicism. And so the Korean translation says, one half of my self-indulgent romanticism and my cynicism and cold dismissal of all things. That's the way that they translated it. So then we get the parentheses, and in the note, the translator writes, cynicism is a attitude of utter dismissal of traditions and customs. So this is one instance in which the translator felt it was very important to go in there and make sure that readers understand that kyonujui, that cynicism, is a very, very bad thing, and should make sure to avoid it at all costs. So this is one really interesting place where the intervention of the translators is very interesting. Okay, I'll go quickly through some other methods of intervention. So a lot of the sexual content is censored. Now, this is not too surprising. A lot of the sexual content was censored also in the original. But even more so, whatever was left in it was taken out completely by the North Koreans. There's a very kind of strict code about what is considered wholesome or acceptable in published materials, and that stuff is all taken out. This part, this next bullet, the omission of Jewish content, was one that was one of the most interesting for me. So what I mean by that, so things are, of course, explained along the way. Like I said before, Chanukah, or as they write Shanuka, or You know, you can't avoid the Jewish content completely, but wherever possible, the translator is, and many times she reflects on the plight of the Jews. And she says, we Jews, or the Jews are experiencing this, or, you know, she really sort of sees herself and sees what is happening to her as part of the Jewish people. All this stuff is taken out. And instead of we Jews or anything about Jews, it just says we, uses the word uri, you know, for the North Korean speakers. So there's an attempt to really make this kind of, I wouldn't say sanitize, but to make this as universal as possible, as a kind of, you know, people under siege, undergoing the most difficult circumstances, so that North Koreans can reflect. And there's even one kind of astounding moment where the translator, I think he must have just not gotten enough sleep or something. I don't understand. I can't explain it, but he translated, she says something about going to a Zionist meeting. He says, oh, I'm not really into it, but, you know, I'm going to go. And then the translator translated it as, well, we're not Jewish, but I'm going to, you know, but I'm going to this meeting. And I thought, what are you talking about? So, I mean, I don't know, you know, maybe the translator was just working in small pieces and it was just a slip, but it's just one of these things where, like, it was clear to me that this is not, I mean, this is really not about the Jewish plight. This is about the translator making this about North Korean, you know, North Korean plight. Of course, like, you know, all translations, the translator domesticates the material. So instead of, you know, Anne uses these colloquial terms like people on their way to work or men in the warehouse, and the North Korean translator really domesticates these concepts and these terms and calls them, you know, workers, 노동자, and you know, and then you know, every time the Germans are mentioned, I mean, Anne calls them Germans, but the North Koreans call them fascist bastards. So there's that kind of extra interpretive layer. And then lastly, I think the aspect of the diary that appealed so much to the North Korean translator was, you know, these last two things, the descriptions of food insecurity and self-critique. So these two things are really important. And here it's important to remember that in 2002, North Korea is just coming out of a massive famine. And it is a famine that wiped out, according to some estimates, something like 10% of the population. And so the population at large is dealing with severe food insecurity. And here you have a diary that has at its center this like deep, you know, this kind of profound crisis of food insecurity, and what to do with rotting potatoes and how to make the most out of, you know, the little food that you have, how to stretch it out over a day. And the reason this is also really important is because for North Koreans living through the famine at the time, they were censoring their own language around food insecurity, because this was something that was, you know, obviously a huge threat to the authorities, the political regime. And so this language around food insecurity wasn't available to, or they had to code it in order to talk about it. And all of a sudden you have this diary that's all about that. And so I think that that's one thing that really appealed. And the second thing that really appealed is, as you know, someone that has been interested in North Korea for a long time, and one of the things that really fascinates me is this 생활 통화, or these kind of self-criticism sessions that North Koreans undergo in their different circles, their different communities. And Anne is like, her mode is a self-critical mode. She's constantly thinking about her you know, her weaknesses and her the mistakes she makes in her actions and in her thoughts. And she kind of models this really, I mean, it's teenage angst and this kind of constant kind of self-reflection that's really so it's so endearing, and it you know, it's so familiar. But I think to North Koreans, it maybe signals also this kind of mode of self-critique that they're very used to. Okay, So, oh my goodness, I am running out of time. I am going to talk really quickly about a documentary that was published in, or that was aired some years back, 2004, by a Dutch journalist who went into North Korea and actually interviewed children reading from Anne's diary. And so this is an incredible document. Unfortunately, and the wonderful journalist who made this, Mariam, Bartelsman is her last name. Miriam Bartelsman, she informed me that the raw footage, all of this stuff was no longer available. I guess the broadcast company got rid of it after all those years. But the material that she has is really fantastic and fascinating, where you see the kids reading the diary and responding to it, with question and answer with the teachers and also with the journalists there. So they say things like, they're reading from the diary and they're asked, is someone still trying to go to war with North Korea? Why is this diary relevant to you, North Korean children? And so they say, yes, the imperialist Americans and Japanese who do not respect the strength of us North Koreans are trying to go to war with us. Oh, whoops, sorry, I'm not trying to do that. As you can easily imagine, and they're reading here, as you can easily imagine, we often ask ourselves despairingly, what is the use of war? Why can't people live peacefully together? Why all this destruction? The question is very understandable, but no one has found a satisfactory answer to it so far. So this is the part that they're reading. And sorry, I have clips for all of these, but I have no time. Do you think there'll be war again? This boy is asked. And he says, definitely, as long as there are Hitler-like warmongers such as Bush, such tragedies will continue to threaten us. Mary, can I have another 5 minutes?
Absolutely, please do continue. This is absolutely fascinating.
Okay,
please do continue.
Sorry, there's just so much to say. Okay, so I won't, there are a lot, I mean, these clips are all amazing and it's all available on YouTube. So, feel free to go on and watch these. They're in, the subtitles are in Dutch. My article that's coming out, I've worked a lot translating it from Dutch into English with help, of course. I don't read Dutch, but one clip I do want to share with you, and this is a clip that's really interesting, and it's a clip that shows that. So what I've been trying to argue so far is that the translator really domesticates this text and makes it about North Korea. So this sort of, in all these different ways that I've shown, the translator makes this text a North Korean text, why this is so relevant. So you think, okay, the translator has done everything that he needs to do to make this text clean and relevant to North Koreans. But then you come across this, documentary, and you see that even in the classroom, the teacher has to work some kind of intervention. And the intervention here that I'm going to show you is the intervention when there is a scene, or maybe a number of scenes, where in the North Korean translation, where the romance between Anne and Peter, takes place. So let's see if this works. So she says, the diary relates a lot of different episodes familiar to your age group that Anne saw and wrote down. There's a lot of talk of love here, isn't there? And then the children say yes. And then she says, we don't have love between boys and girls in our school, but a lot of it shows up here. Do we still have love, in our society? So they say, yes, we do. We have love for comrades, love for parents, and love for our leader. And she asks, which of these is the most precious? Love of comrades. 동무에 대한 나라. What is our, dear leader's favorite song? And they all answer together, it is 동무에 대한 사랑, the love of comrades. That's his favorite song. So you see many of these really interesting moments throughout this documentary where the teachers are having to intervene in the text on behalf of the students, because as much as the translators will sanitize and translate in a way that makes it relevant to North Korea, there will always be some things that will slip. And because reading can never be, it can never be fixed, it can never be dictated. You cannot make people read one thing all in the same way. So I think as a concluding remark, I will, you know what, I'll just share this last. I think this was maybe my favorite. I mean, there's so many favorite moments that I have from Anne's diary. And this is one of them. How noble and good everyone could be if every evening before falling asleep, they were to recall to their minds the events of the whole day and considered exactly what has been good and bad. Then, without realizing it, you try to improve yourself at the start of each new day. Of course, you achieve quite a lot in the course of time. Anyone can do this. It costs nothing and is certainly very helpful. So I love this. I love her voice. I love her, her sincerity, and and I love this idea of this kind of self-reflection that leads to a kind of betterment, the realization that tomorrow's a new day. But I also ask myself, like, how, this is such an example of how the translator can try and twist this and make this about, self-criticism or being, more ideological. But as I've kind of shown, I hope in the brief clips, the stuff slips. And so I think this is a lesson also for those of us who work on North Korea and who read these really ideological texts, to remember that, as much as writers will try and kind of impose a monolithic reading on texts, that readers will read as they will read and make sense of it as they will. So that is what I have for you today, and I'll stop now. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Dafna. That was absolutely marvelous. Thank you for ending with a quote from Anne Frank and kind of bringing that back, because it's been a while since I actually engaged with that book, and I think it's an important one to do so again. So thank you for ending like that. Thank you also for enlightening us so much about such an underexplored topic, and the wonderful story of self-discovery that led to you actually pursuing this. I love the idea that you came across it as a sort of footnote, and it stayed with you for so long, and then you took it forward. I think you said it was 10 years later that you actually started to investigate it. So I'm so glad you did, because that was a really wonderful talk. We have a few questions that have come in from the floor, so I'll go through those first. And then I have a few questions of my own, and I also invite everyone to type their questions for Dafna. We have the first one, I think, is from Avi Gold, who has written a few questions here. I was also actually wondering about this. They say, have you encountered other North Korean translations of diaries of Jewish people or biographies of Jewish people? I was wondering about this too. Kind of, is there a body of literature in North Korea about Jewish people or Judaism in some way? Obviously, we're all sort of familiar with the popularity of reading about Judaism and Jewish people in the rest of East Asia at the moment, in sort of China and in South Korea. So is there anything comparative existing in North Korea?
So my answer to that right now is no. This was, I think it's easier to see Anne Frank in a broader body of work of transnational Western texts than as part of a body of work about Judaism and the Jewish people specifically. And so to me, one of the fascinating things actually is how decontextualized this text is. And so, one of the results, I guess, I mean, it's really, I have not studied this. There's much more, I think, to look for. And, one of the challenges that, I'm sure Avi will can appreciate, in all of our listeners too, when it comes to studying something like North Korea, as I said, you just don't have, you have access to whatever you have access to. So I'm always looking at a very partial picture. So all I can say is that as of now, what I have looked for, what I have found is only this one text. I have not, and then if you think back to like the 50s and 60s and the period of the founding of North Korea, the solidarity, like the third world solidarity that takes place, where North Korea is supporting, it's got its kind of tentacles in Africa. It's supporting Egypt in the Yom Kippur War. There are all these ways in which North Korea has kind of involved in the Middle East, and has this particular sort of view on Jews and Israel, but that does not, that does not translate into a kind of a full body of work. And I will also add one more thing, which is over the last few years, I have had the privilege of meeting North Korean defectors who've escaped either more recently or long ago, and none of them have ever heard of this diary. And so it tells me a couple things. It tells me, first of all, so a lot of our defectors, a lot of our North Korean defectors, in fact, don't come from Pyongyang. They come from the northern regions that border with China.
Sure.
And so there might be a difference here between, what Pyongyangites are exposed to in terms of literature, because the documentary, I think it was filmed in Pyongyang, versus what the kind of education that North Koreans are getting outside.
Sure.
And
do you
also, yeah, go ahead.
No, please finish.
Oh no, just that it may also be that this diary came and went, that it had its moment in the early 2000s and then it just disappeared. And that's something that's very common in North Korea, where you have texts that are read at a certain time and then they're gone and you don't have access to them anymore.
Interesting. I noticed at sort of the beginning, when you talked about the introduction to the book, you talked about there being some form of context about sort of what was happening with fascism and with Hitler and the Holocaust, perhaps. Is that much talked about or known about within North Korea? Would the book have been placed within that context? And is there knowledge of the treatment of Jewish people around World War II?
Yes, that's a great question. And I think the answer to that is yes. So, so for example, when the plight of the Jews, or Judepaktal, or the way that they translate it is mentioned in the introductions, that is not glossed. So the assumption is that when you say, the Holocaust or the kind of elimination of the Jews, that's not something that needs to be explained. And absolutely, the sort of the anti-fascist and the kind of the anti-imperialist, anti-fascist legacy of the Second World War is something that North Koreans are very, very fixated on. And what I think that I learned from this, and I will keep looking for, is what this means for how does it build the North Korean national story, rather than what do we learn about what the Nazis did to the Jews in World War II.
That interests me because of my own research within China, in that sort of the persecution of Jewish people, and also the sort of supposed constructed saving of Jewish people by China through kind of the Shanghai refugees, is very much something that kind of feeds into Chinese nationalism, of course. And so I wonder if there is any slight corresponding construction in North Korea at all. But this is all very, 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 very interesting and very enlightening. Thank you. We have some more questions as well to get to. Avi also asks, he says the cynicism example is very interesting. I found this very interesting as well. Is the tendency of the North Korean translator to describe Jewish practices as a matter of custom or tradition, rather than as a matter of religion? That's a good question.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And yes, Avi, that's exactly right. I mean, I have to think about more about what this means, but, my initial response to that is that, because religion is excised from North Korea with its founding, right? It's, religion is the opium of the people in 1950s. You get all these articles that are, essentially, berating and kind of also just assigning the kind of blame of decadence, of spiritual and political decadence to religion. And so, religion is something that is not, that it's worked very actively against in North Korea. And so this is very much just sort of, these are these interesting customs of these people. And I'll just, explain them because they're in the diary, and I'm going to move on, because really that's not what's at the heart of this book. We're not really, I, the translator, am not really so interested in these materials to what they tell us about the people, the Jews as people, as, just that's in the text. I'm going to explain it and move on.
Yeah, just sort of build on that. It did seem almost as though there was somewhat of an omission of Jewishness from the book, very much. And is there any general knowledge of sort of Jewish people, of Judaism as a religion at all within North Korea at all? No, you're shaking your head.
No. I would have to, I would say, very, very little. I would say almost none. Yeah.
Sure. We also have a request from Avi, who says, could you please put in the chat the Korean term for those self-criticism sessions the North Koreans engage in? I'm not familiar with North Korean society, but I would like to read about this concept. I'm also familiar with a sort of similar phenomenon within China as well. Kind of self-criticism is also something that is encouraged here, and sessions such as that are somewhat encouraged here in parts of China as well.
So to type in the Korean term, yeah.
He asked for the Korean. Perhaps you could do both.
생활 종합, or 자기 비판. Yeah.
Okay. We have another question from Alex Sagan, who says, I don't think Anne Frank refers to herself as cynical. Is that a deliberate mistranslation in the service of the North Korean ideology?
Yes. Yeah, that word did not appear in the English. I don't think it appeared in the Dutch or the German. That was, I mean, I love, actually, I really love that quote. It's one of the many times where Anne is just so beautifully, self-conscious. And I don't know, I really connect with her text. I feel like she's kind of, I feel like I'm kind of like her, or I was like her, when I was 12 or 13. But yeah, that quote, for example, again, it's the English, it's not the Dutch. She calls herself exuberant, right? She says she has exuberant cheerfulness, makes fun of everything, high-spiritedness, takes everything lightly. There's no word of cynicism here, but that is how the North Korean translated it, and then made sure to put in that is a very bad thing.
Sure. It sort of seems to be a sort of North Koreanified version of teenage angst, kind of a teenage sort of self-consciousness in that way. Kind of, we take this and we run with it. Yes, which I find quite endearing, perhaps in some ways as well. I actually did want to ask about the sort of language issues. You were talking a lot that you were working from the English text. Was the North Korean translator working from the English text, or would they have worked from a German or the Dutch?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I mean, this was one of the things that really confounded me, because there's no mention. I mean, so the translator Lee Kum-jin, he translated, I was able to find a few other titles translated by him. One was Theodore Dreiser's Tragedy in America. And he also translated Louise Rinzer's, Louise Rinzer is a really fascinating character. I need to do a bit more research about her, but she traveled to North Korea. She had some kind of, a relationship with Kim Jong-il, that she was very welcome in that country. So her work was also translated. So by the same translator. I discovered towards the end of writing this article, when I'd already just decided that he translated from English, I realized, picking up the German, that it was actually the German that he was translating from. So I had to go back, and I didn't do the line by line, but I went and sort of did spot checks of things that I found really interesting, and it found, I'm 99% certain that that was the text that he was working with.
Oh, wow. So the North Korean translator would have been able to speak and read German.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a, you know, a really kind of interesting point that goes, you know, it's like, you know, interesting for those of us who work on North Korea, just another window into understanding what was language education like. You know, this was translated in the early 2000s, so he would have been educated, let's say, in the 70s or 80s. You know, what was available, you know, not just Russian, but also German. And so, you know, these are, it kind of hints at some broader, you know, educational context in North Korea that we wouldn't otherwise have access to.
Yes, I'm absolutely fascinated to find out sort of how that came about. On that topic of translation, actually, so I have another question around that, which was in South Korea, obviously there are translations of Anne Frank's diary as well. How do you find, or did you look into at all, how the North Korean and South Korean versions differ from one another? Because of course the language is the same language, extremely close.
So yeah, the language has been growing apart for 70 years. So I mean, not to the extent that, you know, they're not mutually intelligible, but it actually is not easy to I mean, there are a lot of sort of habits of language and intonation and vocabulary that's not shared. I didn't do so much work on the South Korean version for a couple of reasons. First of all, there's a lot of great scholarship in Korean, not in English, but there's a lot of really great scholarship on Anne Frank in South Korea. And I wasn't sure in the time that I had that I could really add very much to it. There are also, I learned from reading secondary sources on this material, that there are 160 translations of Anne Frank in South Korea.
Goodness me.
But that includes, you know, children's books and different kind of versions, and, you know, but 160 different translations. And so it's this, I mean, that's just an entire sort of oeuvre that it would take a long time just to kind of wrap your head around, you know, when and what and who. So I haven't had a chance to do it this time, but I'm really fascinated actually to get my hands on the earliest translation from 1954 in South Korea because of the post-Korean War context. And to kind of see what the translators were doing with it in that early time. That's something that I definitely want to write more about. But as far as doing a comparison, I haven't really gone that route. It was just enough for me to just try to understand this text, but it's a really great project. Yeah. Sure.
If there are that many translations, then it would presumably be a very long project as well. Although I'm guessing things like the cynicism element that Avi was asking about, I'm guessing that that is not so prominent or not there within the South Korean versions, I would think.
I would imagine not. I mean, I would imagine, and again, I haven't studied this, but I think if I were to go into this, I would be looking for actually maybe influence of evangelical, Christianity on translations in South Korea, and the whole sort of anti-communist context in which, especially in the 60s and 70s, in which these are getting translated. So yeah, lots of work to be done.
I also kind of wanted to ask, I think you kind of answered this, but I was really hoping you'd have more information about it. Is there any sort of inclination or any suggestion as to how the book was kind of distributed, as to how it was, say, advertised? It seemed very connected to education in the way that you were saying that it was promoted within the country or distributed within the country. Is there any sort of evidence that that was solely the field it was in, or Was it something that you could walk into a bookshop and get hold of or borrow from your friend, for instance? Is there any information about its spread or about its distribution at all?
You know, I'm so sorry. I mean, this is one of the things that are so difficult to learn about North Korea. I mean, all I can do is sort of guess, and also just from conversations with defectors and people who've lived in North Korea for some time. So, you know, there's a student here at Stanford who actually lived in Pyongyang for 18 months quite recently, and he was telling me that, you know, the bookstores there are bookstores for foreigners and there are bookstores for North Koreans, and foreigners cannot go into, you know, North Korean bookstores and get books. So, you know, there's a segregation right there that really makes it difficult to understand what it is, you know, what can North Koreans easily pull off the shelf. You know, all I can say is that the two versions, I mean, they're the same translation, but in two different kinds of publications. The one that's published in Adong Munak, that's the children's literature magazine, is a magazine that has run from 1947 until today. It continues until today. So,
oh, really?
Yeah. So, you know, what kind of access did the, you know, hungry people of North Korea have to this magazine in the early 2000s? I can't say. The journalist Miriam Bartelsman, she walked into a school. Obviously, it was all, you know, arranged in advance, and they agreed to have Dutch journalists and to have cameras in front of the kids' faces. So there was some kind of agreement about this. So, but it's really hard to tell whether this was part of the curriculum that was widespread. I mean, this is part of the frustration, again, of working on North Korea, is you feel like you're constantly blinkered. And, you know, whatever it is that you say about it, you know that there are, you know, you could very possibly, like, you're just getting a very small part of the picture. But that's as far as I can say.
Well, thank you very much for all of the discovery that you have done so far. I think it's absolutely invaluable, and I think I join with Navras in saying that I think this was a very special session, because I really do feel like I learned a great deal from it. I think to conclude, you mentioned that your publication is about to come out. Would you like to let us know more about it and where perhaps we can get hold of it?
Yeah, so you know, it went into queue a couple of years ago, but there's a lot of backlog. So the journal is the AJS, Association of Jewish Studies Review, AJSR, I guess, and it's supposed to come out in 2023. So I don't know exactly when, but I'm happy to, you know, if I remember, email me, or, you know, try and kind of, you know, touch base in 2023, and I'm happy to send off that link. So yes, it will be the full kind of version of it will be coming out.
I really look forward to that. That's unfortunately a long time to wait. I'd love to read it sooner, but I can wait, no problem. So we're coming just to the end now, and there are no more questions from the floor. So I want to say thank you very much for the session and for sharing your research with us. I think it was extremely enlightening and a very kind of personal and very deep quest, I think, and I learned a great deal about North Korea. Navras is also nodding as well. So do get some sleep. Thank you for doing it through such a jet-lagged kind of period, and I now understand why you're so busy as well, why you're in so much demand. But thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day, and maybe go and have a nap after this. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much. This is such a pleasure. I hope we get to meet in person someday.
I hope so too. Goodbye.
Okay, bye-bye.